In September 1944, nearly 20,000 German soldiers were trapped deep inside western France. They were surrounded, cut off, and running out of supplies. They couldn't reach Germany. They couldn't win. Their only remaining option was to keep fighting and die for nothing. Their commander, General Botho Henning Elster, understood that reality, and the decision he made next would trigger the largest German surrender to U.S. forces in Western Europe. But what made this moment extraordinary wasn't just the scale of the capitulation, it was how George S. Patton chose to respond, and the message that response sent to every other German unit still fighting in France. This episode reveals a side of Patton rarely discussed, not the firebrand, not the icon of relentless attack, but a commander who understood that, sometimes, respect could end a war faster than bullets. By September 1944, the German position in western France had collapsed. After the Allied breakout from Normandy in August, Patton's Third Army surged eastward at a pace that stunned even American planners. German defensive lines disintegrated, supply routes were severed, entire regions were bypassed and left isolated. In this chaos, Elster commanded a mixed force of German regular army units and support personnel scattered across western France. These were not elite formations. They were occupation troops, garrison units, logistics staff, men trained to hold territory, not to counter fast-moving American armored spearheads. Now they were completely cut off. The Loire River lay behind them. American forces controlled the bridges. Patton's tanks stood between Elster and Germany. French resistance fighters hunted isolated German detachments. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, making any coordinated movement suicidal. Elster faced three options. None were good. The first was to fight east and attempt a breakout. Militarily, this was impossible. His men lacked the vehicles, fuel, and firepower for offensive operations. They would be destroyed by American armor and air power long before reaching German lines. The second option was to disperse into the countryside and wage guerrilla warfare. That might prolong resistance, but it would change nothing strategically. His soldiers would be hunted down one by U.S. units and French partisans seeking retribution after years of occupation. The third option was surrender. For a German general in 1944, this carried enormous risk. Hitler had made capitulation equivalent to treason. Officers who surrendered could be executed if recaptured by German authorities. Their families could face punishment under Nazi policies. But Elster was a professional soldier, not a fanatic. He understood the military reality. His force had no strategic value left. Continuing to fight would only kill thousands, German and American, for no purpose whatsoever. The rational choice was clear. The question was whether he could surrender with honor and whether his men would be protected from abuse. Through intermediaries, Elster contacted advancing American forces. His message was precise. He commanded roughly 20,000 German troops willing to lay down their arms, but only if certain conditions were met. He sought assurances that his men would be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, that the surrender would be conducted with proper military formality, and that his soldiers would not be handed over to French forces who had strong reasons to seek revenge. The proposal reached headquarters of the U.S. Third Army. This was Patton's operational zone. Any surrender of this magnitude required his approval. Patton's staff brought him the request. Some officers argued there should be no negotiations at all. The enemy was beaten. Why offer terms instead of demanding unconditional surrender? Patton's response would decide not only the fate of Elster's men, but how future surrounded German units would choose to end their war. Patton saw the situation differently. 20,000 German soldiers removing themselves from the war without a single shot fired wasn't a complication. It was an opportunity. Every man who surrendered was one less man who had to be killed. Every unit that laid down its arms was territory that didn't need to be fought over. Accepting Elster's terms cost nothing and achieved everything. But Patton's thinking went deeper than simple arithmetic. How an army treats surrendering enemies directly shapes whether other enemies choose to surrender at all. If German commanders believed capitulation meant humiliation, abuse, or execution, they would fight until annihilation. If they believed surrender meant lawful treatment under military rules, they would choose survival once defeat became inevitable. That distinction mattered. Patton approved the surrender. He ordered his subordinates to conduct it strictly according to the laws of war. German soldiers were to be treated as prisoners of war, protected under international conventions. No favors, no revenge, no degradation. Just professional, regulated handling of a legitimate military capitulation. The signal this sent to other surrounded German units across France was worth far more than any satisfaction gained from humiliating a defeated enemy. On September 16, 1944, near the Loire River, nearly 20,000 German troops, an entire division with supporting units, marched toward American lines in formation. They moved as disciplined military units, not as a collapsing mob. At their head were General Botho Henning Elster and his staff officers. U.S. Army units under 3rd Army Command accepted the surrender. The process followed formal military protocol. Elster announced the capitulation of his command. American officers received it professionally. The German troops were disarmed, organized, and processed for transport to prisoner-of-war camps. Elster and his officers were treated for what they were, enemy combatants who had chosen surrender over pointless bloodshed. This was not leniency. It was adherence to the laws of war governing how professional armies handled prisoners. And that distinction mattered enormously. American soldiers processing the captives treated them firmly but correctly. German troops who had expected beatings or summary executions instead found themselves fed, given medical care when needed, and moved through established POW procedures. The contrast was immediate, and it spread fast. Within days, other German units across France knew what had happened. A German general had surrendered 20,000 men to American forces, and every one of them had been treated according to military law. No atrocities, no reprisals, just disciplined professional conduct. This was exactly the outcome Patton had anticipated. He never met Elster personally. He wasn't present at the surrender. He offered no special privileges beyond what the Geneva Conventions required. But his decision to approve the terms and enforce lawful POW treatment produced effects that reached far beyond September 1944. In the months that followed, German units across France surrendered in growing numbers. Some of the surrenders that followed were small, isolated garrisons cut off from support. Others involved battalion or regimental-sized formations that laid down their arms once commanders recognized that continued resistance served no purpose. American intelligence officers began to notice a clear pattern. German units were actively seeking out American forces to surrender to. They had heard the stories. Elster's capitulation became a reference point. German officers cited it during negotiations. Through damaged but still functioning communication networks, word spread about the general who surrendered 20,000 men, and how every one of them was treated correctly. That knowledge carried real military value. Every German soldier who surrendered was one fewer enemy to fight. Every unit that capitulated was territory secured without battle. Each decision to surrender instead of resist fanatically translated into American lives saved. The cumulative effect mattered. It shortened the campaign in France and reduced casualties on both sides. Patton's insistence on lawful treatment for surrendering enemies created conditions that actively encouraged further capitulations. This was strategic thinking operating beyond the battlefield. But there was another dimension to Patton's approach, one that revealed something essential about his character. Despite his aggressive reputation, George S. Patton held genuine respect for professional soldiers even when they wore enemy uniforms. He despised Nazi ideology and had no tolerance for SS units or hardline party fanatics. But career officers who operated within traditional military codes were different in his eyes. To Patton, they were fellow professionals who happened to be fighting on the opposite side. When those officers chose surrender over meaningless death, Patton believed they deserved to be treated according to the laws governing honorable warfare. This wasn't sentimentality. It was his worldview. Wars were fought by soldiers following orders. When those soldiers made the rational choice to surrender honorably, they should be treated honorably. After the capitulation, Botho Henning Elster and his men were processed through standard American prisoner-of-war channels. Elster spent the remainder of the war in U.S. POW camps. By all accounts, he cooperated fully and conducted himself as a professional officer who had made a difficult but necessary decision. He was treated as international law required, detained, not abused, separated from enlisted personnel, provided appropriate conditions. No privileges, but no mistreatment. After the war, Elster faced a different reckoning. German authorities placed him on trial under Nazi-era military law, where surrender without fighting to the last man was considered desertion or treason. But the post-war German court recognized the reality of his situation in September 1944. His command had been hopelessly cut off. Continued resistance would have achieved nothing beyond unnecessary deaths. Surrender had been the only rational option. Elster was pardoned. He lived quietly in post-war Germany, avoiding publicity. When asked later about his decision, he never wavered. Given the circumstances, it had been the correct choice. And he consistently acknowledged one crucial factor. The knowledge that American forces would treat his men according to the laws of war was what made surrender possible at all. If Elster had believed surrender meant execution or torture, he likely would have continued fighting, not because he expected victory, but because military honor would have demanded it. The professional treatment he expected from American forces gave him the freedom to make the rational decision. Elster's surrender became one of the largest German capitulations to U.S. forces in the Second World War. Nearly 20,000 soldiers were removed from combat in a single action, without a shot being fired. The immediate strategic value was immense, but the deeper significance lies in what it reveals about leadership and strategy. George S. Patton is remembered for bold offensives, relentless momentum, and aggressive tactics, and rightly so. But the Elster surrender exposes another dimension of his command philosophy. He understood that how you treat defeated enemies directly shapes the behavior of enemies not yet defeated. Respect the laws of war. Treat prisoners properly. Give rational commanders a viable alternative to annihilation, and they will choose surrender when their position becomes hopeless. Abuse prisoners, ignore the rules, and even defeated enemies will fight to the death because they have nothing left to lose. That isn't weakness, it's strategic sophistication. Modern military doctrine now codifies this logic. The Geneva Conventions, POW protections, and laws of armed conflict are not just humanitarian ideals. They are strategic tools, designed to encourage surrender, reduce resistance, and lower the human and material cost of victory. Patton understood this in 1944, decades before it became formal doctrine. His decision to approve Elster's surrender and enforce lawful treatment was not mercy. It was calculated strategy, one that happened to align with professional military conduct, and it worked. As word spread that American forces followed the rules, German surrenders increased across France. Units that might have fought to destruction instead laid down their arms. Territory was secured without battle. Time, lives, and resources were saved for the advance into Germany. Elster himself survived the war. He was later tried in Germany for surrendering his command, then pardoned when the courts recognized that he had made the only rational decision available. The 20,000 men he surrendered went home to their families instead of dying in pointless combat. Patton's reputation, already legendary for aggression, gained another layer. A commander disciplined enough to know when to attack, and wise enough to know when accepting surrender, achieved more than destruction. This story matters because it highlights a truth many overlook. The most effective commanders are not always the most ruthless. Often they are the ones who understand that discipline, law, and professional conduct can be as powerful as tanks or artillery. That is military leadership at its highest level. If you found this story compelling, consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps us continue sharing lesser-known moments that shaped the Second World War. And one more thing, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It really helps us understand how far these stories are reaching.